Yeah, we haven't met before. I was excited to read the book, and then, of course, I read it for a second time in preparation of the interview. The first one was for the blurb so a while ago.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, I'm very familiar with the genre, let's say. And also with the content, obviously. So, shall we start?
Yes, yeah. Maybe I think it would be nice to think about how we're framing this.
For me, it's quite clear. It has to be as detailed and as speculative and as theoretical as possible.
Okay.
So it's really, I would say, for an informed public. And so we want to really see this book and then the dialogue really as an opportunity to push forward the dialogues and the discourse and the propositions that you are making. Can also be that you say, okay, we wrote this 3-4 months ago. Let's push it further. So I'm very open to that. The book, it's always a lengthy process of, let's say, recording and storing ideas that have been forming over a number of years. At the same time, we have a very, let's say, fluid situation, let's put it mildly, in which things develop very fast, including, hopefully, also our own thinking. So in that sense, feel free to not just defend the book as a static object, but see it as a process that is constantly evolving. And that's also how I read it, as a proposition. I don't think you call it yourself a manifesto, but yeah, that's, let's say, just in terms of the genre, that's most likely, how many people will read it, whether you use the term manifesto or not. But this is kind of it's in that, but it's a long manifesto. Okay, so it's in that sense, it's more like a speculative proposition. I think that's how I would frame it. But all the more reasons to see it as an open text, I would say, that can be pushed further.
Absolutely, yeah. I had to go grab my notebook, so now I'm ready for serious thinking.
Okay. I want to start with the first question, and this is a very open one for those who haven't read it yet, and that's the question of the necessity to come up with a term like exocapitalism. Before we go into the question, how it relates to other recently proposed forms of capitalism, there's, I believe, an underlying need to see that this object, which is very large in capitalism, is in need of redefinition. And that's why you come up with this term. So my question would be, what is exocapitalism, and how would you explain this wider need to stretch this term, to push it in new directions?
So I can start, and then I think Marek can take over. The term is completely unnecessary, and this might come as a surprise. But the issue is that the term capitalism is so charged with meaning. Different attempts at defining it historically, that is difficult to use. It has become difficult to use. So exocapitalism to us, and this is what I'm saying that is kind of unnecessary, is not a new form of capitalism. We are referring to capitalism as a whole, But the terminological issue, is that the term capitalism is so fully charged that it becomes difficult to use it as a space that is clearly defined. We could provide a definition, but we preferred to just add a small, exo at the beginning to clarify that we're referring to the same thing, but we have to come up with a new word. I don't know if that makes sense. And I think Marek can expand on that.
There's been some consensus that's aggregated over the past. I mean, you can argue when this started, but there's some consensus that finance capitalism, however you want to define that, has produced some challenges for kind of classical leftist critique, right? Especially from the lineage of Marx, and it's produced some challenges to how we have come to understand capitalism in a pretty significant way, as Roberto describes, this kind of sedimented conception. And the problem is that the sedimentation of the conception of capitalism is so extreme that it feels like in order to actually think of finance capitalism, the left or the critical apparatus has had to say, actually, we are in a different period now. Capitalism is dead. No, it's techno-feudalism. No, it's semio-cognitive, blah, 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 whatever different type of capitalism. Fine, no objection to that. But it's something different. And I think what we're literally just trying to propose is a retrojection of finance capitalism backwards through the history of capitalism. And again, we're not historians. And I know that we make some historical claims which can be picked apart. We don't care. Like, that's not really our obligation as we see it, but rather we'd like to kind of propose some what we call a retroactive continuity through which we can understand capitalism through finance capitalism, because we think that finance capitalism is capitalism, if that makes sense. So exocapitalism, I mean, we could talk about what the exo means. That's certainly another answer, but I think that just speaking to I think Roberto answered it perfectly. That speaks to the necessity of coming up with a term, is that we want to say, actually, it's all just been this thing the whole time.
Obviously, this started maybe 50 years ago, something like that. And it's definitely, as you say, it's to do with the relative decline of what in the past maybe was called industrial capitalism, or maybe for a better word, maybe a 19th century capitalism, as as it functioned back then, and of course as it was then defined through the political economy and the works of Marx and later Marxists in particular. I see that. I would like to know a little bit how you relate to the recent attempts to redefine this through the lens, as you say, of finance capitalism. I agree. On the one hand, there's the techno-feudalism, of course, which is emphasizing more like a retrograde move. People are no longer actively involved because maybe at some point they were involved as workers in industrial capitalism, but they are not anymore. Maybe and in some abstract way as a victim, maybe, or as a customer or client of financial capitalism. But then there are other terms as well that recently came up. Of course, there is one that I'm particularly working on. Let's say the platform capitalism, which is of course quite a specific internet-related term. But then again, around the same time, I would say something like the Green Deal or green capitalism came up too, that is emphasizing the financialization, maybe even of the ecology or the answers to the climate change. And so that there's that, of course, that whole process is now completely in tumbles. It's in a crisis. But because no one is really actively anymore promoting green capitalism.
Yeah, I was going to
As
say.
such, for a reason, because it's in so much in a defensive mood. What do you make of, for instance, these two terms, green capitalism and platform capitalism?
And
And
techno-feudalism should be in there too.
techno-feudalism, yeah, which is,
Yeah.
according to Yanis Varoufakis, it's anyway already there's an end to capitalism itself. So he wanted actually to end the debate that we are having here because of because of the maybe terminological chaos that or entropy for that matter, right? And terminological entropy that you pointed at.
Yeah, which he does, and is his prerogative through precisely coining another neologism, which is actually, I think, a better or more descriptive or immediate neologism than ours. Obviously, we have to explain ours, and I don't think he has to explain his. I'm really curious what you think about this. I do feel like, I mean, the platform capitalism and techno-feudalism as kind of critical narratives, they feel to me like they're coming quite a bit from Europe onto the United States, which I think is interesting and appropriate. But if I think about like who is coining some of these terms, certainly some Canadians as well. Definitely, some Canadians involved as well. But I don't see a lot of I don't see that much discussion in the Americas, in the United States rather, about either of these terms necessarily. In part because we are living in the kind of first stage kind of testing or laboratory zone for some of the exigencies of things like platform capitalism and techno-feudalism. Certainly lots of other people are living in those exigencies as well, albeit maybe more direct or blunt or violent or extractive modes than ours, though certainly what we're experiencing here is pretty bleak. I think platform capitalism is definitely a useful way to think about things. And I'm really delighted that platform capitalism has entered the conversation, because I think up until that point, there wasn't that much of a interest in the left or an ability within the left to speak to what's actually going on in software. I feel like there's been a lot of lack of curiosity, to be totally honest, about how software works, how software moves. And platform capitalism, I think, is a really kind of nice first way to really kind of think through what that looks like. I think analyses of platforms like Uber, platform capitalism is a much better way of talking about these things than the gig economy necessarily, because that was the kind of corollary way that people were talking about this at the time. Gig economy is useful, but it doesn't go into the actual mechanics. It goes into the what it feels like, what it feels like to be a kind of hired object or contracted object in those spaces, but it doesn't talk about the dynamics of software. And that's clearly what we're interested in, right? Is the dynamics of software. We talked quite a bit about platforms. I think we're hitting a limit at the kind of elasticity of the term platform to a certain extent. A platform can be a tool that is used to build other things. Like if I think about the Unreal Engine, for example, as a platform, that's an interesting way to think through a platform. It could also be a social media platform, which tends to be 95 to 99% of the platforms that we talk about, but I think is only a small bit of surface when it comes to the actual software economy itself, which is certainly a useful thing to talk about. And then there are the kind of infrastructural platforms, which I think are really interesting, and I think are quite different in how they approach structuring the world. There's a footnote in the book that references, I think it's Larry Page, talking about whether or not Google is a platform. And he says, we don't want to be a platform. We want to be the world, right? We want to be the entire world. And certainly platforms have an interest in approaching something like a world. But I think we go to talk about how Page missed the opportunity, and how what platforms actually became are these almost like membranes or cheesecloth like objects that are full of holes. There's a lot of interpenetration. The platform world is full of other software providers, and we're approaching some kind of neutral platform space where everyone is kind of participating. Thinking about like the relationship between Azure and AWS, for example, To speak about them as platforms is one way of thinking about it, but it's really just a tiny way of considering how these objects actually work, how they interrelate with other software objects, and how they structure the world. We could definitely talk about that. Roberto, do you want to talk about techno-feudalism, or do you want to talk about platforms? I mean, I could definitely talk about techno-feudalism, but
No, I mean, I was going to take a slightly different perspective on my answer. I think there is a tendency, and I'm going to try to choose my words carefully here, in left criticism that probably emerges from the kind of scientific underpinning of historical materialism and so on, towards what I would maybe define as a phenomenological approach to capitalism, which is interesting, which is this idea that you're analyzing a phenomenon that is situated, you can look at variables, and you can correlate them into something that is meaningful. And that is necessary. That is so necessary. But that, from my point of view, remains within what we define as drag, the human force to embed itself into the lift of capitalism itself. And that is very important because that defines our shared space. We have to analyze it. We fully agree with that. It's highly relevant. But I get that the relationship that we're trying to establish with these perspectives is what happens when you attempt to go beyond one scale into some sort of transscalar attempt at, if you want, ontologizing capitalism, a bit more of an ontological drive. Like, what are we actually facing here? And the underpinning kind of, I think, important element here is that when you see teleological connections that make these structures possible, that go all the way up vertically to what capitalism may or may not be, we see that there is a rupture at one point that makes our theological agency disappear and vanish. And we ask, then what? What can we do? I mean, should we stop altogether considering capitalism as something we can modify, revert, and so on, and engage in different types of discourse, let's put it that way? Or should we keep trying to analyze this entity that is a bit kind of external to us in a way? That was my take on that, Mark, but you may want to discuss techno-feudalism as well.
I mean, to me, that relates to techno-feudalism because techno-feudalism, I think, interprets a desire on behalf of certain, let's say, corporate entities, but they're corporate entities that are, I think, largely spoken about through avatars of celebritarian CEOs, right? In a lot of respects, but an interest on behalf of those entities to somehow structure the world of human affairs, which for us is through the lens of the book, like that's nonsensical as an ambition for capitalism. Capitalism, from our perspective, is not interested in humans. It's not interested in structuring human behavior. Humans are very much interested in structuring our behavior in accordance with, to Roberto's point, this impulse that we call drag, this kind of way of making capitalism pay attention to us, essentially. But if I look at an organism like Google, or if I look at an organism like Amazon, the relationship of someone like Jeff Bezos to what Amazon is incredibly arcane. Like, Amazon is a fully automatic dreadnought, and more than that, it's a dreadnought composed of millions of modules of people who have never spoken to each other, who don't know each other, and who are acting in ways that are fully directed by forces, to Roberto's point, that exist on higher scales. So the idea that Amazon is trying to structure the world intentionally, I don't see that. To me, is a misreading of the situation. However, if you go to Tijuana and you look at an Amazon distribution center and you look at the camps outside of workers who are, I mean, to call them workers is already a pretty extreme way of speaking about that situation. It can certainly look like it, right? I mean, it's very easy for us to look at a situation like that and say that is a situation of everything from serfdom to chattel slavery. The reason that something like that exists has to do with a different phenomenon that we call the last mile elsewhere within the text, which has to do with the tethering of these objects to the sphere of human affairs, and more importantly, our lack of imagination as social objects in terms of thinking about how we go about reproducing ourselves. Hopefully that answers the question. So yes, not interested in techno-feudalism. We think that that's a misreading. We think platform capitalism is a solid reading that's should spend a little bit more time in the software minds. And I think, to your point, green capitalism is dead. yeah.
And there's something else about that. When we think about the human dimension of things, I think we think about feudalism, full stop. The idea of integrating techno into the equation. And I read Janis a while ago, but I think the idea of equating technology to capitalism, it's a tricky one. There is a clear correlation, but technology, it's something that is beyond its engagement with capitalism. So I think from our point of view, we are in essence technological animals. And it has nothing to do, in essence, with the system itself. The fact that capitalism is tethered to specific forms of technology that you might relate to, military, the military machine, if you want, and so on, that is there, but confusing both, I think, is a bit tricky, because even if there were no capitalism, I think we would still remain technological animals in a way. Yeah.
I would like to go to another central concept in your text, and that's the theory of scale. Now, can you maybe explain to the readers what, in your mind, happens when something scales? And maybe also contrast it to maybe things around it. What is not scale? Is it something like growth? No, probably not. Is it, well, hypergrowth? Maybe. But the term is so central to you that it must have a special meaning. So please, take us inside this process of scale and scaling.
Maybe I talk about scale from like a software perspective, and then Roberto, you could talk about like experiences with scale. Maybe to set the stage, like something that we have become aware of is that the critical apparatus, which we call, and that could be like a euphemism for anything. It doesn't matter, but we all have in our mind what a sense of what the critical apparatus looks like. It feels like it's struggling when it comes to thinking about things like scale in a lot of ways, and that could be because we've been living in a moment for quite a long time where we've been thinking about agency in a way that I think makes sense in kind of very small constrained environments, but actually doesn't really make a lot of sense in our world, which is that everything touches everything else, and that the way that everything touches anything else is kind of the same. That like if we're in a kind of oopy goopy Deleuzian sort of framework, or I could even pull in someone like Karen Barad here, who I have a lot of respect for, who writes about things like emergence, but for whom there does exist this kind of parity of relations, right? We don't believe in a parity of relations. We think that actually some things touch other things more than other things touch backwards. So we're starting with this idea that it's possible for us to move within a world that is to some extent non-reactive to us. Or it's possible for our agency to be extremely limited when it comes to working with large things.
And would you say that emergence, a term like emergence, is still too much referring to the natural world, or to something like natural growth or something?
Exactly. I totally agree with it, because I don't think it's the right term. I think actually the right term is scale, because like that's the term that we use in software, right? Which is the idea that it is functionally different to build a system. For the example that I give in the book is like, if I'm building an application that's designed to tell you what the weather is going to be like, on one hand, I'm pulling in, let's say, an API to some weather system somewhere, and I'm going to load it on a website. And to serve that to myself in the form of a single app looks very different than to serve that to a million people. The way that the software looks is different. The types of tools that I'm using is different. The location of the software is different. The way that software is broken up and sharded across maybe thousands of servers across the world, when I'm talking about that million level exposure, is very different than my approach to coding something that is existing locally within my environment.
When we think of the scale, my initial association with it is in fact algorithmic growth. So a lot of the things in software scale algorithmically.
Yes.
Can you say something what happens when something grows algorithmically? What happens inside? Because often, in finance, people talk about hypergrowth or something like that. But what is algorithmic growth? What happens there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the best way to think about it is a relationship between resources and efficiency, right? If you are thinking about this in terms of like O sub n notation or something like that, when you're thinking about structuring some kind of application, some things get more efficient the more things that you put into them. The example that we give is like an Amazon fulfillment center or something like that. Not a very efficient approach to leverage for sending individual packages, but actually a surface that gets more efficient with some limits to it, of course, the more things that you push through it. And that becomes much more capable and elastic when you work in the software domain, where you can actually scale to some extent without any kind of limitation. And in so doing, you have the ability to actually get more efficient with the more things that are placed within some kind of a system. And in so doing, yeah, you have the ability to build structures that are quite difficult to understand, quite difficult to manage, and extraordinarily powerful. And there also exists, to some extent, a kind of indifference that's enjoyed on behalf of that system that's capable of something like algorithmic growth, for example, which is precisely this lack of a fixed correlation between resources and efficiency, where like that system starts to care a lot less about the individual characteristic or character of those resources. It instead starts to resemble the kind of structural patterning of computation itself, something very kind of axiomatic, something incredibly efficient. This isn't to say that we're existing in a world where there exists tremendous amounts of efficiency. That's certainly not the case, but rather that the way that people are thinking about structures in a lot of senses, or the structures that pattern our world, are incredibly indifferent to the types of things that are placed inside of those structures. And that's the problematics of scale. That's pretty abstract, though. Maybe, Roberto, you can help me. Yeah.
I think that's a great way to put it. Marek, through his direct engagement with the software reality, has this kind of inner vision that I think is really powerful. If we think about scale, we've been trying to understand and explain scale for a while. We've come through the work of like Zachary Orton, that I think is great, Barika, and so on. There's some really interesting stuff out there. When you think about scale, our human engagement with scale, it's kind of complex. We tend to hallucinate scales into existence in order to be able to cope with the complexity of the sensorial inputs. We need scales in order to survive, and we have to keep generating them. Whenever something goes beyond our ability to understand, we have to scale it into the human dimension. And that's kind of a liberatory force in a way, but it's also simplification of the outer world into something that we can manage. It becomes...
But it's always scaling down, right?
Yes.
We have to scale it down to the human
to
level.
us. That's right.
It's never scaling up to the human level, right?
That is right.
Never.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the book, we discuss these 4 ideas, which are, when we discuss scale, we discuss at scale, which is, this idea of translation of a relation, magnitude that you were talking about, scalability, which is the flexibility of original relationship. So, what happens to a car when you expand it into something larger? Eventually, it stops being expandable in a way. I think we discuss also scalarity, which is the interaction of the components of that relationship. And then what is really crucial to us, which is the scaling problem, which is what we're trying to address in the book in a way. And this idea that flexible relationships do fall apart at scale, and trying to understand why. I think that's important.
I want to now move to the related term that you introduce in the book, which I want you also to explain it to the reader, maybe how it relates to scale, namely lift. Why have you placed such an importance in this term? To what happens when things lift?
Yeah.
What happens?
Yeah, weird stuff. Really weird things. Yeah.
Apparently, yeah.
I was just talking to my mom, who related actually quite a similar story that Carly and Lil Internet from New Models related about a year ago, of the experience of being in a hotel and just navigating the kind of complexity of hotels, especially in America. And my mom described a situation where the air conditioning wasn't working in her room. She's like me. She likes to sleep under quite cold conditions with a lot of white noise. and the room was advertised as having air conditioning, etc. She was trying to make it work, whatever, went down to the lobby and spoke to the manager on duty. And the manager on duty said, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that it's not working. Of course we're going to get this resolved. We'll call in maintenance. They'll take a look and blah, blah, blah. We'll get this sorted for you." A few hours later, maintenance shows up. They go into the room, and the first thing that they say is, "There's no air conditioner in here, and there's no air conditioner anywhere in the hotel. This hotel doesn't have air conditioning." And my mom was describing this experience of being in a hotel where the person and the front desk doesn't work at the hotel, and the person in the maintenance organism doesn't work in the hotel. Both of them are being run by third-party agencies who are kind of brought in, and kind of moved around to different buildings. The first way to look at something like this is through the kind of neoliberal assessment of outsourcing, which is that a company doesn't want to do certain things, so it contracts certain things to other places. And what we want to understand is why. Why does a company not want to do certain things? And for us, it has to do with an economic problem, which is that of fixed costs, which is that physical things are slow and predictable and expensive. And if you want to sell any kind of physical commodity, there's a strong limit as to how much profit you can extract from it. Maintaining a hotel is expensive. There's all kinds of physical assets involved. There's the problems of dealing with humans moving through that space. There's the kind of associated property problems. It's a physical building. It requires constant maintenance. And this is not an attractive business to get into, in the sense that the amount that you could charge for a hotel room is limited. So your margins are essentially constrained by how much you can charge someone reasonably for a hotel room and the maintenance costs associated with providing that service. And what's interesting is that, like, if you go into software, that doesn't exist. Like, the margins are almost infinite in terms of, really the only bill that you have to pay at the end of the day is your AWS bill in terms of hosting services somewhere within the cloud. But if you have your own servers, really at the end of the day, you're just paying for energy. And of course, you have what we talk about, kind of the partnerships of software as a service. But what's interesting is that in software, prices is you can make it up. Like, it can be anything. There's no marginal determination of what price should look like. So what we call lift is the interest of businesses in becoming something like software, and essentially providing software to manage physical assets, then providing software to manage the management of physical assets, and then upward layers of abstraction, as these businesses want to get away from that marginal determination of something like price as it appears on the ground.
Previous generations would call that virtualization of businesses. Is it this similar dynamics? Because you're not using that term so much, and I agree that it's problematic. But
I think it's slightly different in a way, because Marek can explain this further. We focus on the idea of abstraction as the kind of core concept, as a process that folds ad infinitum. And from what Marek was saying before, there is also something that has been explored elsewhere, which has to do with the temporal dimension of how things happen. We speak of this idea of arbitrage, which has to do with time dilation. There's a temporality to exchange between holding something and selling it that increases the value. That's the kind of abstract add-on that we are looking at. Now, if you look at hardware, you're looking at the human temporality, which is slow. Once you move into software, there is this timelessness that becomes part of the equation, where time is not linear and is not linked to the sun and the moon and the natural cycles of how we humans live, but it becomes kind of synchronous, immediate. And then these processes of abstraction can be applied in a much faster way. So that process of lift is kind of increased ad infinitum. So there is a kind of underpinning link to the temporalization of the abstraction processes that has to do with the difference that you may find between producing something that is physical and producing something within the software domain, where time becomes something else.
But it doesn't terminate at virtualization, right? It doesn't terminate. It just continues. Virtualization is applied to virtualization is applied to virtualization. And what we're speaking to is the vector of virtualization, perhaps, as it approaches something like essentially high frequency trading. That's really where the book kind of takes a huge point of departure. If looking at something like Citadel Capital, like what is Citadel Capital doing? It's using stochastic mathematics to look at curves, any curve, and it can go up or down. It doesn't matter. And making very, very small microscale predictions on whether or not that curve is going to continue to go up or continue to go down, and making a few fractions of a cent on each transaction and compounding that at some mega scale in order to actually retrieve some returns. To us, that is a kind of a high point that we've been able to reach thus far of something like Lyft, which is the ability to move all the way up from some kind of token representation of the world, some kind of beholdence of a curve to a physical asset, to moving just within the pure space of computation itself, even mathematics, just leveraging mathematics on random number generators to make bets. And that's the real moment of Lyft, is that moment of departure where there's actually a real break. And we we're going to die on this hill, where there is actually a real break between what entities like something like Citadel Capital is doing and the physical worlds of commodity production or marketplaces or people moving around. There's a real kind of manifest independence there that we think is interesting. And I think that's the real lift. That's the takeoff. That's the moment of detachment from the ground.
And then the question that we get, and we may want to discuss this, is, so what happens when capitalism not only seems to, but actually forgets that it has a kind of material substrate, and that labor is somewhere down there? What happens when it untethers itself from these realities? And that's a kind of big question I think the book is trying to address to some extent. Yeah.
Ecologists would say that moment happens when the electricity is cut off and the water is cut off from the data centers. So how would you describe a moment like that? Because that's kind of what some would call the revenge of the resources. And some really see that happening. Now, whether that's going to be the case or not, I don't know. But it's certainly widely discussed at the moment.
I think it's a great point. It's an important point. I think it's why we see companies like BlackRock, for example, get very interested in energy utilities in the United States right now, which is not about the generation of energy for any kind of human exercise, but simply to continue to power data centers. I think it's important, and it's definitely important to call out. This is the question that we always get asked, and so I appreciate getting it asked in this very intelligent way at this particular point in the conversation. I do think that we tend to limit to that point. This tends to be the moment at which we start to say, okay, so actually this is all dependent on some parity of relations, and actually everything is dependent on the material regime, and actually because of this dependency, we're incapable of imagining what a fully automatic capitalism actually looks like. I think that that's a mistake, because I think that a major point in the book that we're trying to make is that the type of algorithm that's being exercised at something like Citadel Capital is the kind of germinal algorithm of capitalism itself, which is something that could be done on anything. And this is a strong point that is associated with contemporary philosophy of computation right now, which is that computation itself is not dependent on a particular material substrate. It's transcendental to a certain extent. You can do computation on, we always say, on a slime mold. You can do, I'm thinking about the three-body problem, for example, which is quite popular right now. You can do computation on an assembled herd of people holding up signs, right? You could do advanced capitalism on a horse track. You could do advanced capitalism by holding up pieces of paper in an assembled room. I think that it's really important to recognize that, sure, there's a really nice opportunity to pull the plug. We fantasize a lot about this opportunity in a lot of respects. So who dies first, I think, is an important question to bear in mind. But I think at the same time, the message that we want to make sure that is clear to the audience is that capitalism can be done on anything, and in so doing, it can outlive that moment of unpluggedness, and it can continue to scale itself into other regimes, other kinds of mode of communication. Because for us, capitalism is, we're gonna go. Let's just go ahead and say it. We actually think it's to some extent transcendental. Yeah.
At that point, I want to maybe discuss the difference that is important in my understanding between, let's say, this inevitable and very large process of abstraction on the one hand, and the speculative act. So how do these two relate? Because they seem to be two elements of the same coin, the speculative side of it and the abstraction side of it. The one is the more abstract direction, which is abstraction. The speculative side is maybe a little bit more subjective, in the sense like, okay, I put a bet on that, or but not on that. And of course, you describe yourself also as a speculative theorist, and that's what I am too. So I know very well what it means to be in the speculative game of it all. Because we're talking about the importance of concepts. There you see that in the concept, the abstraction and the speculative are coming together, because we put a bet on a concept.
I'm thinking through that question. I think certainly there's a strong relationship between abstraction and speculation, or at least not that abstraction is intrinsically related to speculation, but in the kind of regime of what it is that we're talking about, these two are related. But I think what I want to ask is, like, is speculation subjective in the context of making an economic decision? I think the provocation that we're making is that it can be objective, that actually one can make a bet strictly by exercising a certain domain of mathematics in order to consistently get a return on revenue. And the only kind of limit to that operation is scale.
Okay, but can we also apply that to our own field? And can you say the same about concepts? Because you're now talking about economic movements, for instance, share prices or whatever. But I was more talking about the trade, let's say, of speculative concepts. Because you
Got it.
You do this, but you
Yes.
also write about it quite frequently in the text. I can relate to that.
That's a great question. I mean, we do identify as speculative. I think with that speculative component comes the need to try and articulate something, or the liberty we afford ourselves when it comes to trying to articulate something that is, by our own definition of it, partially or somewhat unknowable, right? That's the kind of point of departure for us. And like, certainly we're taking quite a bit of inspiration from movements like speculative realism, for example, at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, where that was precisely the objective, which is how can we build some kind of framework through which we can access something that is unknowable? How can we build some kind of framework through which we can access, I'm thinking about Kanten Mayasu, for example, and like the problem of the archifossil, the idea that there exists this material evidence of something that comes far, far beyond humans' capacity to experience it, and the inability to kind of access it on its own terms, and the challenges that poses, and also the opportunities that are built in it.
Yeah, in my understanding, speculative concepts can be quite abstract, but then in its use, we want to load them up with meaning, and then eventually they kind of flip and turn and transform, maybe into protocols or into certain description of procedures, and this is kind of also what you do, or at least this is the intention of what you are doing. And I'm also interested in the question how you see that your own speculative concept can scale, or can we even talk about that the theories that you propose can be themselves be lifted?
I'm going to connect the previous question with this one. I think with regards to the speculative nature of what we do, first of all, I think we're happy to admit that we come from outside of the disciplinary reality, if you want, of academic thinking. And being divided between different places, it's good and it's bad. There's a bluntness.
Yeah,
we take risks.
I have no link with that. But,
We take risks. So
I have no academic background in that.
I know. But I'm thinking when people think about what we do, there is a weirdness to the praxis that is. I think it has to do with this fragmentary nature of how we live, how we survive, engaging in critical thinking, but also being part of the kind of industrial dimension of everything that is being developed. The one thing that I think is different about the book when compared to the kind of tradition of the critical apparatus is that, to me, there is no messianic dimension to it. An important part of the engagement with capitalism is based on the inherent understanding that it will collapse, that there is a terminal point to it, and that we have to engage with it to reach that point. I think some of that emerges from the Marxist tradition that sees capitalism as, housing its own contradictions, and then we just have to lead it into the right direction.
Well, also because it's continuous production of crises, of course.
But I don't think we do that. So, in a way, the book hints at a potential practice to answer your question, a praxis, a practical application of these principles that have to do with the scalability of the book itself, but it doesn't really engage with those. I think the idea is more to provide a kind of analytical framework that may serve as a starting point for other people to start thinking otherwise. The book, I think, only attempts to do that. The praxis, the kind of translation of that into a real domain of action and political transformation, that's not something that we sketch in the book. That's not the idea.
Still, when you're talking about finance, I think a lot of the examples that you use are either software related or in terms of financial capital. However, I want to dive for a moment into a field you mentioned once or twice, but not too much, and that's crypto, blockchain, Bitcoin, and all the rest. For the reason that that this is a field that itself is an example of how core speculative concepts have become protocols, have become also fixed in their definition. Let's say there is a fixed definition now of, let's say, proof of stake or proof of work, and people work with that. People even apply it to a certain software stack, and then something happens. So, but of course, in the beginning, these were just abstract, speculative concepts in the same way. And I'm quite curious about that. I want to know a little bit about why you think, in your definition, there are only 21 million bitcoins. If this system that you propose is infinite, then why is Bitcoin not infinite? For instance. And this is a question of definition, obviously, right? This is a definition that this infamous group of people behind Sakamoto has defined. 21 million, not more, not one Bitcoin more. So why there is a limit to this growth in this case?
Great questions. A number of things I'd love to respond to there. The first is now I understand the question about protocolization, which is now makes complete sense to me. This is a concern, and actually I think a very valid critique of the book. I'm thinking through an older piece that Reza Negarestani wrote about Nick Land, for example, which has to do with the danger of theologizing capitalism to some extent and actually manifesting it into reality as such through hyperstition, right? And the best example of this is Black Scholes, which Elena Esposito writes about, which didn't work very well until it did. Like it was a way of describing financial markets. It didn't work very well until significant enough people sort of bought into that being a kind of real way of thinking about how markets might move, and then it became an incredibly good structuring. It became both a structuring object and a way of understanding and making bets on things in real time. So that's I just wanted to address that as like a very kind of valid question, is like, to what extent are we participating in the sedimentation of a problem through some kind of active theoretical hyperstition here? Like, that's the danger of speculation, is that you bring something into the kind of noosphere and it can actually realize itself. Then the question about Web3, or specifically on crypto, definitely very interesting to us, in that it certainly represents lift in a number of different dynamics. The way we talk about, for example, the difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum, I think is like a really nice way to thinking about lift, right? Yeah, right. Like moving from humming GPUs to simply just proof of ownership, right? As a way to kind of continue building more. And so in that sense, you could think of Ethereum as a kind of more lifted way of interpreting the scenario than something like Bitcoin. The question about the original limitation, I'll be honest with you, I'm not. There's so much mysticism around those initial moments around Bitcoin that they intrigue me. But I guess my question is like, is that hard limit in the number of Bitcoin? That's a limit on a number, but the kind of logarithmic limit on value, as you know, we work with smaller and smaller subdivisions of Bitcoin as the clock continues to grow. Will that limit, is that not a kind of a beautiful kind of logarithmic limit? Like, will we actually achieve the number of hitting that total number of Bitcoin, or actually will we just continue to kind of dig into more and more infinitesimal subdivisions at kind of consistent levels of value until we reach that limit? And that's a question for you, I think. Like, I don't know the answer, but my sense is that that's what's happening. I don't know.
Yeah, this is definitely out there. In the same way, there is a certain protocolization, let's say, of the field of going from speculative concept to a large complex structure of software. And this is done through the gate keeping of venture capital, which requires a white paper in which these terms, speculative concepts, are precisely related to one another. Now, how do you look at this economy of speculative concept? Because venture capital is not playing such an important role in your book. A more traditional finance is, let's say, pension funds or hedge funds or these kinds of high frequency trading.
Private equity, I think, is like, we'd probably appeal to private equity as being the kind of thing that we're more interested in than venture capital.
That's correct. Yeah, not really even real estate, which is also quite interesting in terms of the dematerialization that is happening of real estate itself.
Definitely,
right?
definitely, yeah.
Which is, of course, the cause of the 2008 crisis, but continues to play a role in it. However, when we're talking about software, we are really only talking about one type of capital that is decisive here, and that's venture capital. How does this fit into your theory?
I mean, venture capital is interesting. I think, venture capital is precisely as you described it, a kind of gate. But I think if we're actually talking about the financialization of software, it becomes quite decoupled from something like venture capital once it reaches a certain level of scale. Though certainly venture capital is that initial kind of barrier that has to do with facilitating a transition from one state to the other, from seed to Series A or B or C. I just want to suggest that when we're talking about something like private equity, we're still talking about the softwareization or software likeness of a particular economy, albeit in a different framework that doesn't explicitly involve software as a service as its kind of main vehicle of economic exchange. But the venture capital bit is interesting. I talked to quite a few venture capitalists. I think that they're very interesting people. I think that a lot of that decision making is incredibly random. To like identify any kind of trend or any kind of thought mechanics in what's occurring in venture capital is so tempestuous and so like day by day that it feels to me like a random gate. Like it really feels like more of a layered downstream of something more ambient within the kind of furnace of capital itself. For example, like the spending on AI, how it vacillates on a day-to-day basis based on upstream trends, right? Based on like group chats between venture capitalists talking to each other, getting spooked, then getting not spooked, with just like so much flipping between different gates. So I think like it's interesting to talk about like Mark Andreessen. Like we talk about Mark Andreessen briefly in the book, and like actually like what I thought about that particular example that we give about Mark Andreessen was that his particular investment in that AI generated meme coin, right? Which like that's what he enabled. Certainly there was a lot of value that was unpacked by that initial investment and then a retreat. But to me, it's like almost a kind of computational mechanism and not something that's a part of the human layer necessarily. Do you disagree? You write a lot about venture capital.
The whole, let's say, legacy of the French philosophy, not only Deleuze and Guattari, but many more of today, going from Breton to Reza, new models, all the rest, they do not seem to have much of a productive relationship to venture capital. How do you explain that there is this gap between, let's say, this, but with of course the exemption of Peter Thiel, right? He is the exemption, coming from Girard and others, right? So he is probably the only very influential person in Silicon Valley with any direct link or relationship with theory, right? My thesis would be that Silicon Valley has no link whatsoever to all the conversations that are happening in your book or in my work or in any of the people that we mentioned. Why there is this gap, and why is the let's say this philosophical speculation so detached from this very, very important center of software production?
I think we have an answer for that, which is that we think that theory has not done its homework. That theory is insufficiently capable of demonstrating some kind of real understanding of what's going on in venture capital, in the software universe, in enterprise domain, in real kind of operating conditions of finance capitalism right now. As Gen Z says, it's a skill issue. Like, I think that's part of the reason that we're not a part of those conversations. That being said, at the same time, whenever I go to San Francisco, I am pretty incredibly overwhelmed by the visibility of theory within that space. You're right, a lot of it comes downstream from Peter Thiel, but I was just in a kind of very strange, interesting little incubator there with some Peter Thiel people, some Antikythera people, for example. And on the bookshelf was a lot of the books that you and I love, for sure. I think you're right, perhaps with respect to the current generation, but I think that the youth is hungry for some real concurrency between the things that we like to talk about and the way that their actual world looks. That we're not providing. Like, I think that actually there's a failure on behalf of theory to speak to the real conditions on the ground. That doesn't mean that we don't have to be speculative. I think we have to be speculative. I think being speculative is great. I think the problem is that we're not being speculative in a way that's recognizable. And to this, like, that's where the book kind of begins with this, very bombastic statement about how actually a lot of theory doesn't really feel like it's describing the world that certainly that I walk around in, which tends to be about a real misapprehension of what Silicon Valley looks like. So again, I'm going to software, but that's the American economy right now. Yeah.
From your perspective in the book, you really failed to mention at least how you retrospectively look at hacker culture. The hacker culture, I mean, it's not playing a role in the book in terms even of a critical reassessment, let's say, of its dominant obsession, for instance, with surveillance, with privacy, with, let's say, the whole, protocols around open source and free software. All this is not playing any role in your assessment, not even in a critical framework. I understand maybe these are things of the past, or maybe they were related to some point to a hacker culture that was closely aligned to the globalists, to neocon or neoliberal factions, to a world of NGOs, dominated by Soros or whatever, right? I don't know. But it's quite remarkable that even though you have this obsession with software, the hacker culture and the hacker ethics, with all the values I just mentioned, are completely absent.
Another victim of the that beautiful reconsumptive capacity of capitalism that we all know and love, right? I mean, if I think about the latest hackathon I went to was an institutional organized hackathon within a company, right? I participated. I had a lot of fun. But hacker culture is unfortunately a kind of legacy object. Open source is not. Open source is interesting. We could have an extensive conversation about this for sure. I'm thinking about, for example, the tools that are used right now to develop large language model applications. LangChain and LangGraph are open source tools, right? That's pretty amazing. That's really powerful.
And the Chinese are using it in optimal ways.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think the question then is, to what extent are these tools actually the surface through which value is being generated within a given market? I think the answer to that, I would say, is no. But I'm certainly very interested in open source software. I wouldn't say it's a blind spot in the book. I would say that it's a thing that we are writing off for now, principally because of the problematics of scale. China is another thing that if there's an exocapitalism 2, it'll be Exocapitalism 2 : China, which certainly there's a lot of exocapitalist ways to read China.
Yeah, the Chinese reading of your book is something I look forward to. I want to maybe go to a last topic of this interview, and that is the question of the terms that you are using to describe these obvious processes of regression, and you are using the terms retardation, drag, and malaise, right? And so these are things that so many people see around them, and of course, Europe is completely dominated by these processes, but we can see them happening, globally on a worldwide level. It's not like the whole world is dominated by dematerialization and lift and scale. If only, if only, we would all have to suffer from hypergrowth here and there. Quite the opposite, right? And especially in ideological terms, many people feel that feel the drag, so to say. Can you say something about the specific choice of these three terms and what they mean to you? Because you seem to link them only to this kind of human or all too human need to drag the system down in order to get some attention of the system, right? But are there also objective forms of regression, and not only subjective, namely from the human, all too human side?
There are a bunch of concepts in the book that I think are important. That trilogy, that is kind of the core, if you want, of lift that we have already discussed, drag as a counterforce, and fold. That to me is a very important term that kind of filters through, from Leibniz through Deleuze and so on. And I think, in a way, maybe fold is the starting point. If you think about fold, and if you think about unfolding as a dual force that lifts and drags at the same time, and then there is a richness to, I think, conceptual richness to drag that has to do with the human attempt to embed ourselves into something, a process that will not lead us into anything good or interesting. It's an attempt to imitate the lifting process. Folding happens in a two-way relationship, as things lift and as we try to drag. So when we speak about these kind of dragging mechanisms, the idea of retardation, the idea of developing bureaucratic mechanisms that imitate the lifting of capital, we are trying to portray this kind of funny performative engagement with a reality that we know is kind of alien to us, that then becomes translated into the daily lives of how we manage things and so on. Marek, maybe you want to discuss the idea of an objective possibility of drag.
By objective, I think you mean like certainly there's the affective domain of drag, which is malaise. There's that drag as in a drag show, drag performativity, which is certainly a part of it as well, like definitely playing around with that. But definitely, I would say the most important component of drag is precisely that kind of bureaucratization, the kind of roughing up that we call of surface area that allows businesses to build and inject their own kind of weird meta-managerial software or protocols into things that have no need for that, right?
Some call that protocolization.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I think we're trying to incorporate something like protocolization into a kind of wider object. And it also has something to do with scale. I mean, I'm thinking about how, I think this is true in the United States. I'm sure it's true in various parts of Europe as well, like how once a business becomes so big, a human resources department is required, right? And then you have this kind of gradual propensity of businesses to gradually kind of obtain a certain structure simply by virtue of how big they are and the kind of bureaucratic requirements. And this involves bringing in humans to do specific things, and that's exactly the kind of drag layer. It's bureaucratization. It's cutting open the regulatory apparatus and injecting things like protocol and bureaucracy. It's also the kind of like performative character ascribed not just to individuals but to the nation state in general and to its various kind of service operations. Like that's definitely a component of it as well. But I think that the point that we want to make about drag is this accelerative feedback loop between drag and lift, right? The more you cut open, the more lift you experience, the weirder things get and the faster lift moves.
There's a term I associate with this as well that you use quite often in the book, and that's this arbitrage mechanism. Is that part of this as well? Because in the arbitrage, something has to be transformed, negotiated, or transferred back into some other realm. Is that correct? How do you describe arbitrage, and why did you use that term?
Yeah, for us, arbitrage is like that's the seed through which capitalism exists. Like we read capitalism not through labor dynamics, but we read capitalism through arbitrage, right?
But still as a regressive form. It's not progressive. Arbitrage is.
How is it regressive? What do you mean?
Well, it upholds the unlimited force.
Huh? Yeah, regressive in terms of like
in that sense. Huh?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, of course.
Yeah, because it's arbitrage.
It's arbitrage. Yeah.
I think at the beginning of the book we discussed looking at the seed of capitalism as this idea of a translation between different worlds. We introduced that sort of cosmology, and that translation, if you think about, for example, Baudrillard, there is a focus on the symbolic domain, if you want. What we're looking at here is slightly different. That translation is where I think arbitrage plays a role. The idea that in that process of translatability, that entity becomes something else. And that's how value is extracted. And we actually apply that as well to the idea of labor, where we move from this kind of Marxist idea of labor injecting value add into a material reality, into an idea where labor becomes an injection of volatility, which also explains why hardware economies, which are very labor dependent, represent a small injection of volatility, and thus capitalism is not as interested as in software economies, where the labor element has been lifted away from the process, and then volatility becomes more of a driving force. So I think that's all kind of connected into a network of forces.
I associate it more with the processes of capturing in this very wild, almost cancerous liberation of the signs, as Baudrillard described it. There's a moment of arbitrage in which the capture can happen, let's say. Otherwise, it just, it's just so out of control that this moment of capturing value cannot happen. Whether that's regressive or not, it's maybe something to be discussed. But
I think that Baudrillard uses this term that is the fractal stage.
Yeah, I would say for us, like, it's kind of interesting to look at that particular stage that Baudrillard describes and index that as exactly volatility, right? Yeah.
Are you going to expand this speculative proposition into a more thorough work, or do you want to continue the intensive, speculative moment to further drive this and maybe push a certain concept to a limit? How do you go about from here?
It's really nice to ask us about the future right now. Like, we are, I mean, in a sense, this book was exactly a speculative exercise, or even a kind of a hyperstitional exercise, where we wanted to see if there is actually something there. And publishing a book is an uncanny way to go about doing that. But it worked really well, and then it started a big flurry of conversations in a way that was very affirming to us. We're performing a little bit of our own prescriptions here, in that we put it out, we watch the market, and the market looks good. So in turn, we might choose not to exit, but double down. It's an ongoing question, I would say. I mean, Roberto and I are, we're totally bootstrapped, like completely divorced from any kind of institutional affiliation, apart from Roberto's professorship and my own career, which are in completely different things. And we're excited by the moment. We are working on another book, but one that is very much about AI. That's the big kind of thrust of things at the moment.
Yeah.
And I think to me, if there's something I'm really interested in doing in order to flesh the book out, it's situating the book in China, which to me represents a significant amount of speculative opportunity and protocol level opportunity as well.
Yeah, we are working on that. It's tricky, the Chinese market. We do have a lot going on. The book, I think publishing something is always an act of maybe naivety and modesty at the same time. And this has generated a momentum that we need to witness and engage with, I think, to some extent. A book is always a partial take on something, no matter how good. So that engagement that is starting now through, for example, this interview and the book launch, tour that we have next month, that is going to bring into the equation, I think, new energies, questioning of important elements that might have been fleshed out in ways that maybe are more difficult to understand, elements that, should have been there but were not there, taking that into our batteries and trying to reframe things. I'm sure that there will be a continuation to it, but this is more of an absorbing process at this point before we can release something else in the hopefully near future. Yeah.
Okay, I want to leave it here, and thank you very much. Maybe we will meet at some point, in real time. Who knows? So, good luck with the book and the launch.
It's such an honor to be
Thank you so much
by someone who we've studied for so long. You know what I mean? It's such a weird. Thank you. We're very delighted.
No,
and honored.
yeah, it's a pleasure.